time zone event, as you'll see. And so we're delighted to have everybody who's participating with us today. I'm Kevin O'Connell, and I'm the CEO of a company called Space Economy Rising, which is a space advisory firm in Washington, D.C. But I'm also the chairman of the board of North Star's U.S. entity, North Star Earth and Space Systems Incorporated. Today, I'm joined by two longtime friends and colleagues in this conversation. First, we have Dr. Ruth Stilwell, Director of Aerospace Policy Solutions, LLC. Ruth is a leading expert on space and aviation governance. Her current efforts are focused on policy and regulatory issues related to space traffic management. That's going to be pertinent today, obviously. Integration of commercial space launches in civil airspace, and development of cooperative regimes for air and space. Welcome, Ruth. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Kevin.
We're also joined by Stewart Bain, CEO of North Star Earth and Space. Stewart also has worked across the avionics and space industries over 2 decades, having been part of the design team of Canada's RadarSat 1 and 2. Stewart has extensive experience as an aerospace engineer, as an innovator in international business, and he's also a classically trained actor, having helped found the Ottawa Shakespeare Festival. And so, Stewart, it's great to see you again from many time zones away.
Thank you. Yeah, from New Zealand this morning.
Exactly. So perhaps, Stewart, as we get started, maybe you could give our participants an update on the launch. A very exciting time for North Star. Let us know what the latest is on the planned launch of North Star's first 4 satellites.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Kevin, and great to see you, Ruth. Good to be here. This morning, we are planned for launch on January the 28th at 19:15 local time in New Zealand, which puts it at 1:15 a.m. on the same day, January the 28th, in Eastern time. We have been through a few checkouts this week and getting prepared for Rocket Lab second return to flight since last year, and all systems reported yesterday to me through the tech team appear to be go. One of the basic elements that I saw where I'm staying, I'm on a beach house in front of Hawke's Bay in Mahia. The 2 trucks with the fuel tanks rolled by my house yesterday and parked themselves around the corner. So looks like we're getting ready to fuel, and we should be launching on the 28th.
Excellent. Fingers crossed for everything to go perfectly well there. All right, thanks very much. What I wanted to mention at the outset was that we're going to take questions in the chat from the online audience, and I'll get to those a little later in the hour. So if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So let's jump in. We've certainly heard a lot more about space sustainability in the last few years. There's a cacophony of voices about its importance, why it's, why we need to do it for protection of the space economy. But when we think about it, it's really a very complex topic. I mean, people will often say to me, "Hey, Kevin, what's the actual problem we're trying to solve?" And so maybe at the outset, we could talk about, I think most people on this call are probably familiar with at least some aspects of it. But what do you think are the most important aspects that have to be solved, and perhaps in priority order? There's international, there's regulatory, there's technical. You might give us some initial thoughts on what the most important aspects are in your own mind on this. Ruth, you want to start us?
Yeah, I'm happy to. But first, Stewart, I'm honored to be asked to be here today to help you mark this event. I'm very excited about the launch coming up. We'll be following it very, very closely. So that was a big question, right? What are all of the issues with space sustainability? And one of the questions that I got asked is, like, what are the levers that'll influence a positive outcome? And this is a very important discussion. We talk about space sustainability. Everybody talks about there's not that much clarity about what it is. So let me put it into the context of any big environmental challenge. There's not one thing that says, if we do this, we will have a sustainable space environment. It will take many initiatives, large and small, from governments, industry, academia, the entire space community. So going back to that question, what are the levers? I like to start with what is a lever, and it's just a simple machine that increases the force output from the input. And that's important. So what are these triggering things that can help us achieve sort of that big goal that we call space sustainability? But when we ask for the regulatory question and the macro view, the biggest macro view about the regulatory question in the orbital regime is that it is an international domain. And so we can't just say, let's just regulate, because we have every country has a right to participate in space. They have a right to say how they operate in space, and they may have different priorities. And global agreements realistically may not be possible. So how do we move forward in an environment where a global agreement is not possible? The fact that it's difficult, the fact that it may be impossible is not a reason to do nothing. It is a reason to lean forward to establish positive norms through visible action. Because I like to say quite often, you don't need an agreement for everybody to do the same thing. We can say, we are going to do this, and others can follow, and never say, let's sign a piece of paper that agrees we're going to do it. That's the idea of sustainability, is it is a common interest, regardless of your political position or your relationship between the other actors in space. We all benefit when space becomes more sustainable. And too often the question is, do we regulate or not regulate? And, you know, there'll be a lot of debate on this. But I believe that's a false choice, that the absence of regulation doesn't create a healthy environment. Rather, it risks incentivizing overconsumption and to the point of destruction. But that's not to say we need to immediately jump to regulatory solutions and what they are. We have a global society that's dependent upon space-based services in our everyday lives. So to create an unhealthy environment is an existential risk. So what can we do? What should we do to create a balance? And how do we move forward using the lever of government and commercial cooperation to achieve our common goal? It's not a competition. It is not government versus commercial. It is, how do we form a partnership that creates that effective lever? So again, let me put space sustainability in the construct of any other environmental challenge. What should we do? We should reduce our footprint. People can reduce their footprint through independent action. There can be regulatory action that requires it, and there can be incentives that promote it. But how do we consume less resources with a space object without diminishing its mission or its desired intent, what we want to accomplish? And when we talk about space sustainability, what is that resource? And that's where we get to sort of narrowing the question instead of just talking about this big picture. Space, the economics call it an expendable common pool resource. Okay, that's very technical jargon, but it just states that you can't really use it up. So the problem we have is congestion. It's not that the resource is consumed for all time, it's that the resource is consumed for the moment. But our footprint is defined by the uncertainty. Uncertainty is how we consume that resource. The more uncertainty about where a space object might be, the further away we need to stay from it to protect our asset. The footprint of a space object is larger because our uncertainty about where it is larger. And that's where space situational awareness comes in. Reducing the uncertainty of the position of a space object will do more for space sustainability than any constraint on access could ever produce. So I've got a lot of things to say on this. You know me well, Kevin. You know I can talk and talk, but I'm going to stop there and let you put in some more questions. But in terms of that big picture, it's not one or the other. It's not who can do what. It's not one solution. It is what can we do together. And so when we talk about space situational awareness, that is one of the big levers that can change the picture of space sustainability by allowing everybody to reduce their footprint.
Okay, thank you, Stewart.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great setup by Ruth. Perfectly aligned with the philosophy that you're presenting. And so if you map that onto my world, or the world that we're trying to create at North Star, we start with asking ourselves a very deep question at the onset of the company 12 years ago. What is the best way to monitor space so that you have the most accurate predictions, ephemerides, of where objects are or going to be in the future? So the prediction of location of objects to provide, if you like, the best navigation tool So if everyone is working with the same navigation tools, the best navigation tools, you've given us a fighting chance in the context, I think, of a lot of things you just touched on in terms of, voluntarily people want to sustain the environment. Regulatory can do a certain amount, but there has to be a will. There's always ways to interpret the rules, but if what we're really trying to do is sustain the space, if you've got powerful tools to navigate, you're reducing the error ellipsoid, as we call it, or the area or the footprint that an object has in space down to meters instead of kilometers, or yards instead of miles. You're doing a ton to improve the sustainability probability. You're increasing our probability of being able to navigate. And again, it's not just the immediate action of navigating about an object that is obviously in front of you. It's also about not identifying false collision warnings, so that people are much more secure and not navigating when they don't have to, or changing their course when they don't have to. So the fundamental principle for me goes back to an engineering principle. How well do you monitor space, and what contribution can a tool bring in its accuracy? And that's where all of in terms of what Northstar brings as a tool, it's also a complex combination of things that I've never seen before, at least in my experience. You've got astrodynamicists, you've got astrophysicists, orbit dynamicists, you've got software engineers, you've got people that write algorithms, you've got pure physicists, you've got all these folks working together, and their personalities are very diverse, and their agendas and ways of working are very diverse. But when you bring them together, and if you can coalesce that human factor so that we're all rowing in the same direction, then you produce a product that's never been done before, but you also set the bar for how other companies could do it also. Because if we're all working with that level of broad thinking, lateral broad thinking, we're bringing new types of products to the table that make very useful and productive use of things that sometimes strike fear in the hearts of humanity, like artificial intelligence. If I'm monitoring 128 million objects a day, I'm going to want to use an outside source, artificial machine learning source, to help me track where everything is and where it's going to be, and when it goes outside of certain parameters that could cause a risk. So when you combine all these things together, you have a really great compass. You have a great navigation tool. So it wasn't by accident that we called the company Northstar, Earth and Space. It's meant to provide that line upon which we can travel.
So I think, thank you very much. I think I'll reserve the right to play panelist for at least a couple of minutes in this conversation as opposed to moderator. But maybe tie the two things together very quickly. Understanding what the situation is in space, how things behave, what they're doing. I think that's absolutely the baseline for where we have to improve. I said that a lot when I was at Commerce. I continue to believe that's really the top priority. Because if I don't understand the problem, I run the risk of managing it poorly. I have run the risk of a lot of other things because of that uncertainty, as Ruth has said. The other part of this is when you think about regulation, regulation that's informed by technical and scientific data is typically much better than regulation that's just done as a well-intended gesture by people who are trying to do good. And so I think that's really a top priority, is sort of understanding behaviors, space behaviors in the space environment. Very good. So off to a good start on this. Let me turn to Ruth on a question. When we think about space congestion, space debris, we're often thinking about orbital activities, et cetera. But one of the things I've spoken about before, and I know you've thought about, is the impact of congestion and debris on the launch community. Because, the last time I checked, many of the things that have to go into the space economy actually have to go up to be part of the space economy. Not all of them, and so can you talk for a minute about the thinking that there is in the launch community about this problem and how you manage civil airspace issues and a whole host of other issues that are out there?
That's a big question as well, Kevin. So when we talk about airspace congestion, that's getting through the airspace with your rocket to get to space. That's one set of questions. And then there's the orbital congestion. You need your object to be able to insert into a safe place where they're not going to be at risk. And depending on where you want to put it, how many layers you have to get through. So if we look at this as one picture, right, you have to get through these layers. You have to get through like the immediate layer, and there's civil air traffic. Then you've got the stratospheric layer where there's some growth opportunities that are happening in the unmanned community. Then we might see another layer of congestion. Then you've got whatever orbits you have to get through in order to safely get to your destination. That's a lot of things to miss. So in airspace, we have a lot of very good data. We know where the objects are. We know where they are going. There is no debris in the airspace. It is self-cleaning because we have gravity to help us with that. So the fact that we have good information and we have the ability to control those objects because there is no debris in the airspace creates now an economic question. And that is the balancing the interests of the space community with the aviation community, because there are equal rights to access the airspace. There's not one company or one industry that can deny another the ability to access that resource. But there needs to be a balancing test. And as orbits get more congested, the limitations on your launch window become more complex. So that poses a constraint on your ability to be flexible to balance with now the commercial aviation industry. So these things cascade downward. So we can't just look at them in separate boxes anymore. We need to look at that total picture. So if we can get better information about what's happening in space, that gives us more flexibility for launch timing and adjusting. And then we can more effectively balance the demands of aviation against space, because neither is full. Things are congested at certain places and certain times, but as the total volumes of either space or airspace, they're not full. The question is, can we more efficiently use where the high demand areas manifest? Because there's a reason that high demand areas are high demand areas. There's value to those markets.
Yeah, there's some good new work on carrying capacity in different orbits and things like that. I mean, people are working on these problems, definitely. But I think you're making a very interesting point that there's cascading effects. We can't think about space sustainability as kind of a thing contained in a box, because we see many, many different second and third order effects in other sectors and other areas, et cetera. So that's good. Stuart, anything on that?
No, I pretty much just would echo the sentiments that you guys are putting up. Not every object in space can maneuver, even if it's an active satellite. And then there's the vast majority of objects in space that are uncontrolled resident space objects. And what we're really talking about when it comes to navigation is giving sufficient information to either folks that can remove debris, like astroscale, being able to remove a defunct satellite, or the ability to navigate around it. And sustainability is really about and congestion in space, as you were referring to. They go hand in hand. You have, as you talked about it, it's an excellent concept to consider the carrying load of an orbit. And like to make an example of what it's like on Earth, there's really prime real estate, and there's places that are more remote, that are not so attractive. A lot of orbits that are very popular are sun-synchronous polar orbits in certain alignments that give optimum view of the Earth for Earth observation. They also work well for communications, and those orbits tend to get very heavily used. And what I'm thinking about is, if you're thinking from a regulatory perspective, I also think about it from an economic perspective. Good economics means if I can do something with 10 satellites instead of 10,000, why would I put up 10,000? So you're thinking, how do I economically put in an equation regarding how much occupancy you can have on a space, given the fact that your throughput, either for images for Earth observation or for telecommunications, is really the driving factor. If I can have the same throughput with a smaller number of satellites, then that's kind of a driver that we'd want to be looking at, whether that's done through the ITU or that's done through another regulatory manner. It's not just frequency interference, it's literally becoming physical interference. And it also gives an opportunity in terms of timing, an issue for developing countries who may not be able to get up so quickly to have access to those prime real estates. And so we're not just marking the territory, we're leaving it open for others to use in the future.
So Stuart, let me stick with you on this question. You've worked both in the remote sensing business, now also in the commercial SSA business. What do you see as some of the unique challenges for entrepreneurs in these specific areas?
I think the main focus for me has always been it's not a data sale. You're not selling data. You're selling information that has been contextualized, whether it's Earth observation or whether it's space situational awareness. If you're going to reach a larger audience beyond a scientific community, government leads, that's for sure. They're always the lead client, and they do tend to have their teams of people that can process the data. But commercializing the data and putting it into the hands of a larger audience really requires more contextualization. The raw images that come into our satellites, for example, that are about to be launched, are not immediately usable. I mean, that's where we've invested tens of millions and years to develop that capability. It's something that requires all the folks that I referred to earlier: astrophysicists, orbit dynamicists, algorithm writers, etc. And then the software interface and the API, and then the machine learning. You bring all of those things into play. And when we're talking about bringing data in from other sources, you're talking about bringing data in from satellites that already exist or using star tracker data. It's fusing all of that data together. So from an entrepreneur's perspective, what you're trying to do is create the best operating picture. And so really that's where the focus is.
Yeah, I think another development I might just highlight for the audience is that, we've finally seen, after a handful of years, we're starting to see the investment community, the private investment community, pay much more attention to the space sustainability aspects of specific company business plans. And so the extent to which they're engaged in this as well and starting to understand it better, I think that's a positive force. And the certainty that we're aiming for with new data actually will encourage increased entrepreneurship and investment. And that's a good thing for the space economy.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, and if I may, bringing
Please.
investors into the equation, there is, I think, an inherent responsibility on the investors to be judicious about the programs they get behind and what we launch. I've made this reference a couple of times. I'm sure it's the same in every country, but in Canada, before you dig a hole in your backyard, you have to call the city to make sure you're not hitting a wire. And so the expression is call before you dig. I think we need to be thinking before we launch. There's a lot of stuff that's getting launched just to test things out. That's fine under a good controlled environment, but launching just for the sake of launching and occupying space is not good economics. It's also not good for the environment. I think we need to be thinking along those lines naturally for the preservation. So thinking about what we're launching and having investors get behind business plans that are sustainable as well. If the business plan is sustainable and the model is sustainable and it provides good value to the community or to the clients, then it's a good, it's got all the right earmarks, but it's got to have a good balance. And that's where we get into the stuff that Ruth was talking about at the beginning. There's so many variables that are going on here, but if you try to take that broad view, you tend to, I think, to move towards what is almost, to a certain degree, self-regulation. You're making choices that are driven by natural forces, economics, science, collision, probability of collision, etc. They all start to come together and lead you towards, I think, a natural set of choices that are, I think, more sustainable just by nature.
Thank you. So let's stay on regulation for just a minute. I continue to pay a lot of attention to what people's ideas are about regulation. I've told a story many times before about doing an interview, and the interviewer said, Mr. O'Connell, why don't we just stop everything till we figure it out? And I burst out laughing in the interviews because that's not going to happen. It can't happen. It shouldn't happen. It won't happen. And so the question is, what are the kinds of regulations people are thinking about that are what we would call light touch, relatively light impact on the industry, but still effective in shaping behaviors of businesses that are quickly coming into the market. Ruth, have you heard any ideas of things that you see people thinking about in this area that are helpful?
Yeah, when we talk about where regulation adds value, which people don't like to talk about, but I love to talk about, because, as I said, an unregulated environment, it doesn't create a healthy environment. We've got questions like Stewart brought up, are you launching just to launch? okay, well, if you're demonstrating technology, fine, we can develop areas where it's safe for you to do that. You don't have to do it into the most congested and popular orbits. But also this question of just because you can launch an object, does that give you a right to leave that object as pollution in the orbital domain? And what are the requirements to take your objects out of space when they are no longer functional? And that's, been a big one that people talk about, whether we have a 25-year rule or a 5-year rule, or if it's a rule, or if it's just something people talk about and is not enforced.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, if you are launching a large number of satellites with a business model that says, I know that I will have X failure rate, at what point is that acceptable for your failure rate to create a pollution problem for other actors in the space? And so what is the obligation to then deorbit those that are defunct, or create a performance standard that if you are going to operate in these highly congested orbits, you have to meet X performance standard because you are imposing an additional risk on other actors. And that starts to get back to, like I said, that push and pull between different users of the airspace. We're going to see that model explored in space, where there's a push and pull, where just because you were first doesn't give you the eternal right to leave your objects there when the technology is available to take them out of orbit. And so we have rules that were based on the technology that was available at the time, which is why industry needs to be very engaged in the regulatory frameworks, because we don't want outdated regulations that no longer meet our needs. And you don't want regulations that are too costly to meet so that they are just ignored.
Right.
And when we get to these questions where it is a safety question, are we creating an unsafe environment in space? I wanted to go back to something Stewart said earlier about false alerts. Are you having to maneuver too often because the information isn't good enough for you to make a good decision? This is where we have a clear aviation analogy. False alerts are a problem that is examined very, very carefully with every new technology, because the risk of a false alert is that it creates a numbness to alerts, and that you then don't take action when you need to because you're so used to the bells and whistles going off. We need to make sure that our structures don't create that they're not so cautious that we risk people just tuning them out. So where's that balance? Where's that performance standard? So when we think about regulation, we should definitely be looking in a performance-based way, not thinking about like a prescriptive standard that says use this tool or that tool, but one that says you need to perform at this level. That if you are below this level and you're leaving satellites in space and you're wanting to launch more, that should cascade down to your next launch approval. Have you cleaned up the debris that you've left before we allow you to put more objects in space? And that's a country by country activity where when I talk about leaning forward, we have the opportunity for the states of launch that are very, very active to take more, I don't want to say aggressive because people hate it when I say that, but more proactive positions that say your future economic opportunity is predicated on your behavior today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we have, I think we have examples of the false alerts problem that really resulted from the Russian ASAT test back in November of 21. Space operators routinely said, we're facing these squalls of alerts. And again, as I think everybody knows, that someone who's warned constantly typically does nothing because they don't know what to do. That has huge economic consequences for space operators, especially commercial space operators, but frankly, all space operators, because they have to make some very, very hard choices about whether to maneuver or not maneuver, what would happen. And so, this is another part of the problem. To go back to my very first question, this is one of the problems we're trying to solve, which is to improve decision accuracy for people who own satellites to basically be able to make much better decisions about whether to move or not, and remain efficient in their operations and sustain their mission in the process. So it's just another dimension of what's truly a multidimensional problem. I just say that a couple of ideas that I've just heard more about lately in the ideas about regulation campus, and that's really all they are, much more willingness to do data pooling and data sharing on maneuvers, on technical data. It matters if there's a paint chip that's coming at you as opposed to an old telescope that someone couldn't control. That's one category. The other is one in which, there are government mandates for space operators to actually leverage supplemental commercial SSA capabilities to really sharpen their own precise knowledge about where they are in space. It's not needed for every kind of space operator, but others. And so those are just two categories of ideas that we've heard bouncing about. Stewart, do you have any thoughts on this?
Attribution is a very important aspect of space situational awareness, and you just touched on it by giving an example: paint chip versus
Telescope.
broken piece of telescope, whatever. It speaks, not to give an advertisement, but it speaks to again North Star's approach to solving the SSA problem, which is you have to have good attribution, and you have UCTs, uncorrelated tracks in space that cause different types of problems. We don't know who owns the object. We don't know where the object came from. It's not in the catalog. It's not properly cataloged. And so you're creating these unknowns. That's another aspect that we have to deal with, which raises the bar for the quality, or the keyword that I think Ruth was keying on, or at least I was keying on, is performance. I think performance is the cleanest word that we'll all agree on. You want to have a performing business, you want to have a performing system, you want to have a performing operation, you want to have a performing service. Performance is the common thing. And if you're doing more than you need to perform, or you're not doing enough to perform, you're outside of the performance parameters. And so it's a natural guideline for decision making. So I really like the concept of judging or assessing or making decisions based on performance. And I think we should really focus on that, both as entrepreneurs to provide better tools, and also on the investment in business side to say, what's the performance of this system? Everybody, when they get in an airplane, knows that there's a flight plan. And so if a satellite operator is registering a flight plan, we agree they should, but not going to follow that flight plan, either willingly or unwillingly, but mostly unwillingly. If your satellite can no longer sustain its orbit, you have a responsibility to get out of the way. And not just to say, I'm going to take 25 years to decay. And because for those who don't live in that aspect, that's the world that we live in space, is that it doesn't just immediately fall out of the sky and come to the ground. You've got a long decay cycle, and it's managing that decay cycle that creates a lot of challenge.
So you've actually teed up the next question quite nicely, which is that you've both worked in aviation, aeronautics, other domains. And of course, we continue to seek metaphors for what's going on in space. Some people like the aviation domain, some people like the maritime domain. There are other examples that people are looking for. Are there areas where, from based on your experience, where either of you see things that are helpful to think about, or particularly not helpful in either case, that are drawn from your own experiences in these other areas? Ruth, you want to start?
Yeah, so this is also one of my favorite topics, and
I know
aviation metaphors are my favorite thing, right? So there's a lot of really good ones. The big one, which is a nice metaphor for SSA, is we increase the carrying capacity of the airspace through surveillance information, period, right? Yeah, we went from 100-mile separation between aircraft to 5. That's big. And that is just on having more precise information about where the aircraft is. But in the bigger picture, there are ideas from both maritime and the aviation domains that are very, very useful. Ideas are useful. There is no plug and play from one to the other that we can just go check, we got this. We'll just change every time it says sea and write space, every time it says air and write space. So when we look at the ideas, the big difference between aviation regulation and space regulation is that there is a sovereign entity that has exclusive control over a volume of airspace. We don't have that in space. So regulations that depend on that are not useful to us. But we do have 404 international agreement on standards and behaviors. And that is a model that could be very, very useful, because when we create a standard based on safety, we have international agreement regardless of political position and opposition between the countries. So one of the things that I like looking at is the airspace classification, where we look at where those high demand areas are, and where there is high demand and high congestion, there is a higher standard in order to enter that airspace. So if we're at, a very desirable low Earth orbit, in order to enter that orbit, you should be maneuverable. You should be able to deorbit your object in a reasonable amount of time, have a space surveillance system that allows you to detect threats so that you don't get hit creating debris for other people. So those are like some standards that people can agree on because they start to make sense to protect the safety of the orbit. At the same time, you don't want that same standard from the Earth to cislunar because you'll exclude a lot of operators. You don't want to impose a maneuverability standard so that universities can no longer launch a satellite in an orbit that's below this space station and isn't going to pose a threat in those orbits. You want to still encourage those innovative users to be able to access space in a way that's appropriate. But how do they know if you haven't started to classify and quantify it? So that's what airspace does. They say, in this area near an airport, you have to do X, Y, Z. In this area, which is 92% of the United States, you just have to have an operating transponder, and below 10,000 feet, you don't even need that. There's plenty of room for everybody to learn, develop, experiment. It just moves the risk away from the highly congested and competitive areas.
Sure.
Those areas are open to everybody. It just is a performance standard in order to operate there. And there is global agreement on what those classifications are and why they exist. So there's an excellent model. From maritime, we have the similarities between space and aviation space and maritime, in that they're both international domains when we talk about the high seas. And there are some things that the sea is a little bit more like space because stuff stays there after it breaks and it creates a hazard to other things. So we can look at those models. Can you do it exactly the same way? Do you want space pirates and give them rights of salvage and be able to bill for their services? That might get a little more difficult, but we should look to it. And we should look to what is accepted by the global community as a tool that works effectively. Things like the Treaty on Removal of Wrecks and Pollution, those could start to break through and allow us to say, if you've abandoned something in orbit, while the Outer Space Treaty says it's yours forever, if it is creating a risk to other actors, what rights do the other countries have to remove it if you're not going to? We need to start thinking forward and where those models start to become more useful for the space community. But like I said, plug and play, no. Ideas, absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah, Stuart, thoughts on this?
Yeah, on the little peninsula I'm on in New Zealand, there's a list of about 25 wrecks that are around the island. They're all well mapped. Everybody knows where they are. I think I won't try and improve on the excellent answer that Ruth gave. I think the one thing I'd like everybody to be thinking about as either a layperson or somebody who's remotely connected to the space industry is that we always run a great risk of being disconnected from space, like it's something we're not connected to because we can't see it. It's something you don't see. Everyone needs to know for a fact that nobody knows exactly where their satellite is at any moment in time. We do a mathematical prediction with all the folks I talked about earlier to say where it is. So it's something you don't actually have a direct physical connection to, but that doesn't diminish the impact that it has on all of us when something happens in space. So an ASAT test, the Secure World Foundation came out with, I think, an excellent statement on this and a document that Northstar signed up to, is that doing an anti-satellite test and destroying an object in space and creating 1,500 pieces of debris or more where there used to be one is an extremely deleterious thing that you would do to an environment. It's very detrimental to the safety. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean you haven't caused tremendous disruption and damage for others that needs to be navigated. And you've taken something that was in one orbit and you've moved it out into multiple orbits because you've run a kinetic object through it and changed its orbit dynamics entirely. And so those aspects are very important on top of all the things that Ruth talked about. I tend to gravitate more to the maritime model rather than the aviation model, because of the examples that Ruth gave and the one that I just gave. So I think those are my experiences on it. But my biggest concern is how disconnected anybody who's involved in this, either remotely or directly, can get from the fact of how challenging it is up there and how much a problem you're causing for yourself and others if you're not behaving in a principled and secure, meaning safe way. It's just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't have a huge impact.
Yeah, I think I'd just add one quick point on this. We've talked before about the state of international geopolitical the situation and the impediment that creates to reaching full global agreement on anything related, even to safety at this point. It's very, very difficult. I think the other part I draw from the maritime example is that the maritime example is one where the private sector actually helped develop some practical rules of the road for operations that ultimately became codified under law of the sea and some of these other things. Not all of them, but I think that's another place we can look. It's not that these ideas are going to only come down from government. They also should be generated by industry. In the space business, we know about confers. Confers is looking at standards as a specific market segment emerges. I'd like to see more activities like that where industry is deliberately thinking about safety and help share their best practices with others. So very good. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm checking to see that the questions are coming in. We've got a handful of questions. I'll get to those in a couple of minutes. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, maybe get some commentary. We always talk about the congestion and debris problem, and it is clearly the top priority thing we have to worry about. What we know is debris threatens the lives of astronauts. It threatens the billions of dollars of investment that we and all of our allies have made in space. And it certainly threatens all of the things, the exciting things that we talk about being part of the future space economy, even if it's to diminish them as opposed to preclude them from actually happening. But I think we want to look beyond that just briefly. Again, that's the top. Safety is the top priority problem. The security complexities in space, sort of right there with them. But I think what we need to remind people is that there's an additional opportunity that lies beyond that. And as we think about a cislunar economy, as we think about in-orbit servicing, as we think about commercial space stations, et cetera, the same kinds of data, exquisite SSA data that is being made available in the first instance to help with the debris problem and the congestion problem has enormous potential and frankly will be needed to achieve those missions. When your satellite comes up to mine to inspect it or refuel it or in this not too distant future, make some sort of repair to it, we're going to need that exact same kind of exquisite information to do that. And so I think in our mindset about this, the safety piece, the security pieces are at the top of the list. But I think we also should not fail to recognize the enormous potential that lies beyond it and the critical aspect of having data to actually make those things happen. So I'll take questions from either of you or comments from either of you on that, actually.
Stewart?
To me, it speaks to, I don't want to try and change the subject, but it struck a chord in me while you were talking, Kevin, that it talks to me about our dependence on space. And we depend on space. We are interdependent as humans on each other, and our entire interdependence is depending on space for our normal daily lives. I'm harping back to your comment earlier, and I don't want to ridicule it by taking it out of context, but we can't just stop operating in space. You can't just turn it off and say, okay, that'll protect it and it'll go back to normal. The objects will be there for tens of years, some of them 100 years, depending on their orbits. And the understanding is when you're launching a satellite into space, it has a fixed lifetime. And those satellites must be updated. Those satellites must be repaired. The GPS satellites, the communication satellites, and the Earth observation satellites that we use to gather more than 50% of the data that we use for climate change all have a finite lifetime, anywhere between 5 years in a low Earth orbit, 15 years in a geostationary orbit, and they all just stop working and they come down. That's the limitations of the laws of physics and how we're going to be able to operate. So we must have access to this environment, and we are dependent on this environment. So I think it's really important as we explore, this topic and the one that you've just brought up, that we don't lose that connection to our dependence on space and what we need to do to address that. So that would be my opening salvo to maybe set something up for Ruth to think about.
Yeah, so we get kind of twisted around the debris problem because it's a huge problem. It's also probably one of the most difficult to fix, because collecting particularly small debris, even with all of the innovation in ADR, isn't about like throwing out a giant net and scooping out millions of pieces of debris. So we need to look at what behaviors are necessary to not make the problem worse is the number one thing, because we can do that. We all recognize that spent rocket bodies, because of their mass and the risk of explosion and all of that sitting in orbit, is a bad thing. And so a bunch of scientists from all around the world got together and said, let's make a list of the most dangerous objects. And they did, and they were all spent rocket bodies. That was in 2017. There are more spent rocket bodies in orbit today than there were that day. So we need to think more proactively about preventing potentially debris generating behaviors. The ASAP ban was huge. And again, that was not reached by agreement. That was the United States saying, we are no longer going to do this, and we've committed to it. We're going to ban direct descent kinetic destructive ASAP tests. 132 countries followed as a result. It wasn't sitting around the table for a decade reaching an agreement first. It was at some point saying, you know what? It is not good for any of us for us to do these things that make the environment we all operate in more dangerous, leaving spent rocket bodies. Why is that still happening and increasing? That increases our debris risk. The things that we do that make it more likely that the problems will get worse are probably our most dangerous behaviors today. And taking steps to change the way we think about that, just because that's how you always did it. The way you launched a satellite in 1972 should not be the way you launch a satellite today. We have opportunities to take advantage of more modern thinking, more modern technologies, and ways that say, not just can I get my satellite to orbit and keep it there, but can I ensure that it does not create an additional risk in an increasingly congested environment? And that's a change in how collectively, as a society, we think about space operations. I know New Space likes to talk about themselves as startups. It is not a startup industry. There are startups within the industry, but the industry itself is not a startup. We cannot continue to talk about space like it's 1958. Space is a stable commercial environment that we need to protect. Experiments happen in all commercial industries. Great. Let's not treat the entire industry that in a way that doesn't recognize we need to move forward hand in hand.
But the economic argument, I think, brings us full circle. I think what you were touching on, Kevin, is one that's near and dear to, I guess, my heart, and I guess thanks yours as well, is that in the end of the day, there is the debris issue, the immediate debris issue. But when you start talking about, or anyone starts talking about private space stations, cislunar activity, etc., you're talking about beyond debris into a big data play. It's a big information play. So when I look at what North Star is doing, you're first mapping out where everything is, but then you're facilitating a space economy the way GPS facilitates an Earth-based economy. If you have accurate locations of where everything is in space, think about all the ways that we use GPS now that are ubiquitous and in our lives, invisible and ubiquitous in our lives. That's the same way we would be using really high performance space situational awareness data to have a space economy, and economics driving it. The space economy is the world's economy. There's no separation. It's our economy. But activity in space is going to have more impact on our economy than anything else in our lifetime. And so our collective lifetimes. This is a huge opportunity. And so I think that is not a replacement for regulatory, but it's a natural driver for proper behavior because everyone wants to exploit an economy. It's about exploiting a natural resource, and space is a natural resource, and it's a finite natural resource. So I think the congestion aspect and the debris aspect is the immediate, bugs on the windshield, but we're actually taking a very long drive here into the future of what we're doing, and we're getting far past that, navigating through this in the short term, but then using high-powered, high-precision, high-accuracy degree information and data and location that facilitates a much more powerful economy, and that doesn't come from one entity. North Star never did, nor should sell itself as the sole answer. We already know that we must rely on other sources of data to get a great picture. You don't just do it with one source. Hence the global interdependency. You have to have locations in the Pacific, in the European, in the North and South hemispheres to properly monitor all of this, and so we're all, I'm back to that interdependence. It's a global problem, it's a global economy, it's a global solution. It may be the biggest opportunity for us to look at a global economy or a globalization in a much different way through the lens of space. Space is where we all play globally, and you cannot pollute a part of it and not affect both yourself and everyone else. And so, but in the end, Kevin, sorry to take so long on this, but it is leading towards that vision of a big data play. And in order to get there, we have to preserve it starting now.
So I want to hit. Go ahead.
Just
go ahead.
like grab on that real quick, because I always get asked about the government stuff, but what is the role of the commercial space industry in all of that? And it's very, very important because Stewart mentions GPS. GPS didn't become $100 billion economy because the US government put up a GPS constellation. It's because the US government made a policy decision to make that signal available so that the commercial industry could build applications that nobody had even dreamed of before. So that infrastructure that government provided was built upon by innovators around the world, not by one company, not by one country, but by people who had ideas and visions about what was possible using that basic tool. And I think we'll see the same in space, particularly in space SSA, because the commercial sector will build those tools that are valuable to the users of the system, that increase the value of the infrastructure itself. So that partnership is an opportunity sort of to break open all of the opportunities that space can provide that we might be limited in our current frameworks.
Yeah,
so
short advertisement on this, and I know we're running short on time. I want to get to.
I know we've got questions.
The chat questions, but Stewart and I are going to be speaking on February 6th at NGA in Washington, and we're going to talk about some of the parallels between these different market segments that we've seen: commercial remote sensing, GPS, and how they inform what we're going to do in the SSA domain. But I couldn't agree more. The other point you made, Ruth, that I think is important to foot stomp is that, when we say we can't reach global agreement, some people say, well, we should do nothing. Well, that's exactly wrong. I mean, you have to take a position. Allies and like-mindeds need to move together and do as much as they possibly can, and either, cajole or bring the others along one way or another. And so, all right, let me, Stewart, I want to ask you one quick question, and I'm going to go review the questions in the chat. The one question that we get asked all the time is that as a commercial SSA provider, how do you see the balance of government and commercial demand for what you're doing? Obviously, the satellites are going to go up this Sunday, knock on wood, but talk about how you see demand from the different communities there.
Yeah, so we sort of ran into the field thinking it would be one way or another. Things have very much landed in the court of government leads. Government has immediate needs, both on a civil and a military side, to look at the problem. Those both speak to security and safety and navigation. And so the government is the lead internationally. All around the world, governments are interested in figuring out what they can do. And they typically have in the back of their minds, not so far back, and what impact that's going to have on their policy and regulatory framework. And so government leads. North Star has signed agreements with, we publicly announced a while ago, a collaboration with SES Global, one of the largest, if not the largest, revenue generating commercial satellite operator, who's operating very interestingly in medium Earth orbit and geostationary. Medium Earth orbit is very interesting. For the folks on the line, it's somewhere between 2,000 kilometers and 35,000 kilometers. It turns out it's on the equator. And you've got a series of O3b mPOWER satellites there, about 22 of them. If you move one of them, you move all 22 of them. So a maneuver to avoid is not a pleasant thing for the astrodynamicist operator in the mission control room at SES, because now he's risking all 22 satellites who are connected together, and they're living in a belt where objects are coming in and out at 16 kilometers a second or 10 miles per second, that are spent rockets that took objects out to the geostationary belt. And locating those objects is the hardest trick that you'll ever want to do as an astrophysicist, orbit dynamicist, because you don't see it often enough and it's moving too quickly. And so working with commercial operators, it's about performance. It's about performing on delivering your data service, and it's about security of your assets. You want your assets to be safe. And so we are seeing an uptake there. There has been a lot of movement in other areas. Inmarsat made a lot of a discussion about the coalition of the willing and creating an initiative there, a very positive effort there. I think the really hard thing for everyone is where's the budget for it? And so that's the challenge that we're all looking for, is where's the budget to buy the service? We're all talking in sustainability, humanity, preservation, platitudes, but the rubber hits the road when people are signing budgets to say, I'm buying the service, I'm investing in the development of the service. And so that's the challenge we face at the leading edge of that activity.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to get a few of these questions in, so we'll try to ask if folks could just try to answer them quickly. There's a question about comparing space-based SSA to ground-based SSA, and obviously that's going to take more than 30 seconds to do. That's one question. Then there's a question about SSA on the moon. Definitely a capability that will, the early days of the moon will be developing infrastructure capabilities like SSA, communications, PNT, things like that. Stewart, you want to try that first question quickly? Again, it's a hard question to answer quickly.
Real easy, quickly. Hopefully, we can follow along. Ground-based, passive, Earth, space-based, active. So when you're on the ground, you're waiting for something to go through your fishnet, and you're going to detect it as it passes through. When you're in space, you're in orbit, and you're moving, and you're scanning, and you're not waiting for an object to pass through. You're actually actively looking for it. You're not restricted by territory. You're not restricted by weather. You're not restricted by accessibility or geography. In space, there's none of those restrictions, so you have better coverage. On the ground, there are major gaps in the southern poles and around the Antarctic and in certain geographically denied areas. So what space does is fill those gaps and give you a better operating picture.
The last question, there's a question about aspirational initiatives. There's a lot of good, positive talk about space sustainability, and again, it's much louder and larger than it was in the last, in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's a good thing. But in many ways, some of it is aspirational. Are there ways to make some of these things more concrete and get them to execution? Anybody have any thoughts on that? And the part of the question had to do with parallels in the aviation industry. I don't know if there's an answer there, Ruth, would be helpful.
There always is. You find me a space thing, I'll give you an aviation thing. Yeah, the main thing is incentives, right? So we talk about these like goodness things, right? That's good for society. And then Stuart's right. Then how much is goodness worth on the bottom line? And the question is, what are the incentives? What do I see as a return on my investment when I subscribe to an SSA service? And so in aviation, that's a big one. If you want to increase the performance on the aircraft, we have required navigation performance that delivers you a benefit. You have access to certain airspace if you have it, that you're able to operate more efficiently, that we can do tailored approaches. There are things that you get in exchange for investing in that technology. And some of them are policy-based and some of them are simply the physics of the matter. It allows you to operate on those procedures. So, this goes back to one of the ideas I have about airspace category. Orbital space categories that mirror airspace categories. If you perform this way, you can access that high value, high congested orbit. So you can get to, if you subscribe to an SSA, that gives you the ability to operate in these congested areas. And so there has to be a connection to incentives. It has to look back at not a broad, but a clear connection that if you have this, here's the benefit your company receives because you have that. And then you start to have something you can answer on that bottom line of the budget. And if we just tie it to it's good, it won't get there. If we tie it to and then you can do this, we start to get there.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, I think we'll have to stop taking questions. I wouldn't dare to summarize this pretty packed conversation for the last hour, other than to say, as we started, space sustainability incorporates a whole host of both challenges, international, technical, regulatory, others, but also tremendous opportunities. We've seen tremendous growth in attention to the problem, partly for the reasons Stewart talked about. A starting point is improving deeply our knowledge of where things are in space and how they behave. And with that, Stewart, of course, we're going to wish the best for your Sunday launch and go from there. And I definitely want to thank everybody who joined us online today. Again, sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth.
Happy
Bye-bye,
New Year's.
everybody.
See ya.